In the final months of World War II, George Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any force in the history of modern warfare. His tanks were 40 miles from Berlin. His men had momentum, fuel, and blood in their eyes. Then the order came down: stop, do not advance. And Patton, the most aggressive general America had ever produced, had to stand there and watch the war end without him. This is no man's land. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New documentaries drop every single week. To understand what the order to stop meant to George Patton, you have to understand what kind of man he was before that moment. Patton did not think of war the way most generals did. He did not think in terms of supply lines and casualty projections and political considerations. He thought in terms of velocity. Speed was the weapon. Not tanks, not artillery, not air superiority. Speed. He believed with absolute conviction that a fast army killed fewer of its own men because a fast army kept the enemy off balance, kept it reacting instead of acting, kept it dying before it could organize a coherent defense. By the spring of 1945, Patton had proved this theory across 800 miles of European soil. He had broken out of Normandy when everyone else was still arguing about hedgerows. He had crossed France at a pace that left German commanders writing frantic radio messages about an American armored force that seemed to appear from nowhere. He had turned his entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter in 72 hours to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver that military historians still study as one of the most audacious operational pivots in recorded history. His Third Army had liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and advanced farther than any comparable Allied force in the entire European campaign. By early April of 1945, the Third Army had crossed the Rhine, punched through central Germany, and was sitting on the western bank of the Mulde River. Berlin was 40 miles to the northeast. The German military was collapsing in real time. Units were surrendering by the regiment, by the division, in some cases by the corps. Roads that had been contested killing grounds 6 months earlier were now open and undefended. Patton could see the end of the war from where he stood. He had spent 3 years and half a continent building toward this exact moment, and he had no intention of stopping now. 40 miles is nothing to an armored column moving at full speed. Patton's tanks had covered 60 miles in a single day during the breakout from Normandy. They had crossed entire countries in weeks. 40 miles in 1945 against a German military that had been bled white across 6 years of total war, against an enemy that was surrendering by the division, against a road network his engineers had already cleared and mapped, was not a military obstacle. It was a morning's work. Patton knew this. His corps commanders knew this. His division commanders knew this. Every officer in Third Army headquarters knew this. The Germans knew it too. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding what remained of German forces in the West, later said in his post-war memoir that his greatest fear in April of 1945 was not the Soviets, who were still fighting their way through the eastern suburbs of Berlin block by bloody block. His greatest fear was that Patton would turn northeast. If Third Army moved on Berlin, Kesselring wrote, there was nothing left to stop it. The road was open. The defenders were gone. The city was waiting. But there was a problem that had nothing to do with tanks or roads or German resistance, and Patton understood it even as it enraged him. The problem was political. In February of 1945 at Yalta on the Black Sea coast, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin had sat down together and divided post-war Germany into occupation zones. The agreements made at that conference assigned Berlin to the Soviet zone of occupation. The Americans, the British, and the Soviets had all agreed on the map before a single Allied soldier had crossed the Rhine. On paper, Berlin was already Soviet territory. What Patton wanted to do in April of 1945 was drive his army into a city that had already been promised to another country, in violation of an agreement signed by the President of the United States. That was not a military decision anymore. That was a diplomatic catastrophe waiting to happen, and the men above Patton in the chain of command were not willing to let it happen regardless of what his tanks could physically reach. The order to halt Third Army came from Dwight Eisenhower, and it came in early April of 1945 in the form of a directive that realigned Allied strategic objectives away from Berlin and toward the National Redoubt, a supposed network of mountain fortifications in Bavaria, where intelligence believed Hitler planned to make a final stand with his most fanatical remaining troops. Eisenhower's decision to redirect the main Allied effort south and away from Berlin is one of the most debated command decisions of the entire war. His critics, who included Winston Churchill, Bernard Montgomery, and eventually Patton himself, argued that capturing Berlin was not just a military objective, but a political one, and that the psychological and symbolic value of the German capital made it worth the cost and the diplomatic friction with Moscow. Eisenhower disagreed, and his disagreement came from a place of genuine strategic reasoning rather than simple caution. His job, as he understood it, was to defeat the German military in the field, not to position the Western Allies favorably for the post-war settlement. Berlin, in his analysis, was already politically lost. The Yalta agreements had made it Soviet. Racing to capture it would cost American lives, possibly tens of thousands of them in urban fighting against fanatical SS units defending the capital, for a city that would have to be handed over to Stalin the moment the fighting stopped anyway. Why spend men on a trophy you cannot keep? That was the logic. It was cold, it was unsentimental, and it was, by any conventional military calculus, defensible. But Patton did not think in conventional military calculus. Patton looked at the map, looked at his army, looked at the open road to Berlin, and said something that his aide Chester Hansen recorded verbatim in his diary on the evening of April 12, 1945. He said, "We had better take Berlin, and quick, and we should go on to the Oder without delay." He said it the way another man might say something entirely obvious, the way a man says something that seems so clear to him that he cannot understand why everyone around him does not see it. Patton did not take the halt order quietly. He never took any order quietly. What he did in the days after the directive came down reveals something essential about the man and about the impossible position he occupied during the final weeks of the war. He argued. He pushed back through every formal channel available to him, pressing his case to Omar Bradley, his direct superior, with a force and persistence that bordered on insubordination. He wrote in his diary with increasing bitterness about the political interference that he believed was costing American soldiers their lives and costing the Western Allies their best chance to shape the post-war world before it hardened into something that could not be undone. He said explicitly and repeatedly that stopping at the Mulde while the Soviets took Berlin was a mistake that America would spend decades paying for. He was talking about what we now call the Cold War, and he said it in April of 1945, before most people had even begun to imagine what Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe would actually mean for the people living there. But he also obeyed. This is the part of Patton that gets lost in the legend. He was not a rogue commander. He was not a man who simply ignored orders he disagreed with. He pushed hard against the directive through legitimate channels. He made his objections clear and on the record in language that left no room for ambiguity. And then he did what soldiers do. He followed his orders. He halted Third Army on the Mulde River, and he held the line while Soviet forces fought their way into Berlin street by street and block by block. He held it while Hitler died in his bunker 50 feet underground on the afternoon of April 30th. He held it while the German High Command sent its final surrender delegation west to find an American officer to surrender to, because German soldiers and German officers uniformly preferred American captivity to Soviet captivity. That preference, which Patton observed firsthand in the final days of the war, told him everything he needed to know about what kind of peace was coming. The most striking thing about Patton's behavior in the spring and summer of 1945 is not his anger about Berlin. It is his clarity about what came after. While other American generals were already thinking about going home, about parades and promotions and the comfortable peacetime careers that awaited them in a country eager to celebrate its victory and move on, Patton was thinking about the next war. He said so openly and repeatedly, in terms that horrified his superiors and eventually got him relieved of command. He called the Soviet Union the enemy, not a rival, not a difficult partner, not a complicated ally whose cooperation was necessary to manage the post-war settlement. The enemy. He said the Western Allies had made a catastrophic error in allowing Soviet forces to occupy Eastern Europe, and that the only way to correct it was to rearm the defeated Germans and march east before the Soviets could consolidate their hold on the territories they had just taken at the cost of 10 million of their own dead. He was not speaking theoretically or rhetorically. He believed it was a serious military option that the United States should be actively considering in the summer of 1945, while American forces were still in Europe in strength and before Soviet occupation could harden into permanent political reality that no army would ever be asked to reverse. His superiors were appalled. The war was barely over. The American public wanted to come home, wanted to see their sons and brothers and fathers come back from overseas, and wanted never to think about European geography again. The political climate made even the private discussion of conflict with the Soviet Union an act of diplomatic heresy. Patton was forced to walk back his statements publicly, and in October of 1945, Eisenhower removed him from command of Third Army and reassigned him to lead the 15th Army, a paper organization with no combat troops, tasked with writing the official history of the European campaign. It was a humiliation wrapped in a title, and Patton understood exactly what it was. Historians have spent decades arguing about what would have happened if Patton had been allowed to take Berlin. The debate has two serious sides, and both of them have real evidence and real logic behind them. The case against allowing Patton to advance is the one Eisenhower made at the time and has defended ever since. Berlin had already been assigned to the Soviet zone. Taking it would have violated the Yalta agreements and potentially fractured the Allied coalition at the exact moment when cooperation between the great powers was most needed to manage the German surrender and prevent the kind of chaotic post-war fragmentation that had followed the First World War. It would have cost American lives, possibly many thousands of them, in the brutal block-by-block urban fighting that Soviet forces ultimately endured when they took the city in late April and early May. For a city that would have had to be handed back to the Soviets or negotiated over in conditions far more tense than the ones that actually prevailed. The case for is the one Patton made, and it becomes harder to dismiss with each passing decade of historical distance. What the halt order actually produced was a situation in which Soviet forces occupied not just Berlin, but all of Eastern Germany, all of Poland, all of Czechoslovakia, all of Hungary, all of Romania, all of Bulgaria, and the eastern half of Austria, creating an empire of occupied territories that stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic, behind what Churchill would memorably call the Iron Curtain. The Cold War that followed lasted 45 years. It consumed trillions of dollars on both sides, proxied itself into shooting wars across 3 continents, brought the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation on at least 2 documented occasions, and shaped the political and economic lives of hundreds of millions of people across Eastern Europe in ways that are still being reckoned with today. Patton looked at the map in April of 1945 and said this arrangement is going to be a catastrophic problem. He was not wrong about a single part of it. George Patton died on December 21st, 1945. He died not in combat, not from a bullet or an artillery shell, or the 1,000 other ways the war had tried to kill him across 3 years and 2 continents. He died from injuries suffered in a minor traffic accident outside Mannheim, Germany, on the morning of December 9th. A 2.5-ton army truck ran into the staff car he was riding in at low speed, on a road he had passed over dozens of times during the campaign. The accident, by any objective measure, was trivial, the kind of low-speed collision that might bruise a shoulder or crack a rib. But Patton was thrown forward in the vehicle and suffered a fracture dislocation of his cervical spine at the 3rd and 4th vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down within minutes of the impact. He was 60 years old. He had survived the Western Front in the First World War. He had survived the North African campaign, Sicily, Normandy, the breakout across France, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final advance through the heart of Germany to the Czech border. He had been shot at, bombed, strafed, and mortared across decades and multiple continents. He had been involved in serious riding accidents, vehicle accidents, and aircraft incidents throughout his military life. He survived all of it without serious injury. He survived the most mechanized, most destructive, most lethal war in human history. He died on a quiet German road in occupied territory, 12 days before Christmas, in a collision so minor it barely damaged either vehicle involved. He knew he was dying. He told his wife Beatrice, who flew from the United States to be at his bedside, that he did not think he was going to make it. He died in his sleep 12 days after the accident in an army hospital in Heidelberg. He was buried in Luxembourg at the American military cemetery there, among the men of Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. He had told his staff he wanted to be buried with his men. They honored that request. There is a version of the post-war world in which George Patton lives. In that version, he is 60 years old when the war ends, healthy and furious and politically marginalized by a military establishment that genuinely does not know what to do with him in peacetime. He gives speeches that embarrass the Truman administration. He writes his memoirs with a bluntness that scandalizes the diplomatic community and sells millions of copies to an American public that has complicated feelings about its victory and about what is already starting to happen in Eastern Europe. He says in print, in plain language that anyone can understand, what he said in private about the Soviet Union, about the decisions made at Yalta, about the halt order on the Mulda River, and about what all of it is going to mean for the next generation of Americans who will be asked to contain the consequences of those decisions. He might have been a figure who shaped the early Cold War debate before it calcified into the rigid ideological postures that defined it for 4 decades. He might have been the voice that said publicly what George Kennan was saying in classified cables, what James Forrestal was saying in private meetings, what a handful of clear-eyed men inside the government already understood but could not say out loud without political consequences they were not willing to accept. He might have mattered in that argument, or he might have been sidelined and discredited and dismissed as a warmonger by a country that was tired and wanted peace, regardless of what the map said about whether peace was actually available. Both outcomes are possible. What is not possible is knowing which one would have happened, because the voice went silent in December of 1945, 12 days after a truck bumped into a staff car at low speed on a German road, and the argument he was making did not find another voice with anything like the same credibility for a very long time. The debate about whether Patton should have been allowed to take Berlin will never be fully resolved, because resolving it would require knowing the outcome of a decision that was never made. But the man himself resolved it in his own mind well before he died, and he left the resolution on paper in the diaries and letters that his family preserved and that historians have been reading ever since. He believed the Western Allies had won the military contest and lost the political one, and that the halt order on the Mulda River was the precise moment when those two outcomes separated from each other and began moving in opposite directions. He was sitting 40 miles from Berlin with the best army he had ever commanded, with nothing between him and the German capital but roads his engineers had already cleared and a German military that had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. He was told to stop. He stopped. He obeyed because he was a soldier, and soldiers obey orders even when they believe those orders are wrong. But he spent the rest of his short life believing it was the most consequential mistake of the entire campaign. Not a military mistake in the narrow tactical sense, but a political and historical one, made by men who understood the map in front of them but failed to understand what the map was actually for. A map is not only a picture of where things are at a given moment. It is a picture of where things will be. The line you hold in April of 1945 is the line the world lives with for the next half-century. Patton understood that with a clarity that very few men in positions of power shared in the spring of 1945. He held the line he was given, watched another line get drawn further east in smoke and politics, and the exhaustion of men who had been at war for 6 years. And he knew before most people had begun to ask the question that it was the wrong line, drawn in the wrong place, for reasons that would look very different in 10 years than they looked in the moment. He was right. He was right about Berlin, right about the Soviets, right about the Cold War, and right about the cost. He was just a man who ran out of time before the world ran out of reasons to ignore him. George Patton was 40 miles from Berlin when they told him to stop. He obeyed. He spent the rest of his life believing it was the worst order ever given on the Western Front, not because of what it cost in 1945, but because of what it cost in the 50 years that followed. If this video meant something to you, hit the like button. It is the single best way to push this story to someone who has never heard it. Subscribe if you are not already. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.